What role did the 53rd Battalion play in the defeat at the Battle of Isurava?
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 100 of the Principles of War podcast. A not insignificant milestone as we celebrate 100 episodes and over 720,000 downloads of the podcast. 100 episodes where we've taken current doctrine and applied that to military history. We've done this to try and highlight the lessons learned from these battles. Many of these lessons have been paid for at a very high price, a price paid for in blood and treasure. That's why it's really important that we learn these lessons, we remember these lessons, so that we don't have to pay such a high price next time. That's why I think it's really fitting that on this 100th episode, we are looking at the performance of the 53rd Battalion. Short of actually winning the land battle, the most important role of any army is the raise, train and sustain function. Generating companies, battalions, brigades, divisions, corps, even full armies. It is a difficult thing to do. It is even more difficult when it is done under significant time pressure. But this is the way that Western democracies most often mobilise. It is in a time-constrained environment in response to an attack from an aggressor. This will be the last episode that we look at the performance of the 53rd Battalion on the Kokoda Track during the Battle of Isurava. They are about to be ordered back to Port Moresby because Brigadier Potts, the commander of Maroubra Force, has lost confidence in the ability of the battalion to fight. The performance of the 53rd Battalion up until now has been patchy at best, but it is really important to remember that all of the victories of the platoons and the companies of the 53rd Battalion, that is all them. The defeats and mistakes that they've made, they are the result of decisions and actions of those above them. Some of those mistakes a long way above them. Once we've finished looking at the performance of the 53rd Battalion, we're then going to unpick all of the mistakes in the raise, train and sustain function, as well as the employment, so that we don't make those mistakes in the future, particularly if we're required to mobilise rapidly. We're picking up the story at midnight on the 29th, 30th of August, 1942. Maroubra Force has just fallen back to Isurava Rest House, a location just south of Isurava itself, due to significant pressure from advancing Japanese forces that are outnumbering the Australians on the track. Potts is very keen to get the 39th Battalion out of the line. At this stage, they are down to just 150 men who are fit for combat. They've been fighting for a very long time, and they're very close to culminating. Dawn on the 30th of August sees a very confused command and control situation for the 53rd Battalion. Companies are spread out across the AO, sometimes under the command of other battalions. But that is no different to the companies of the 39th, 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions. Because of the tempo of the Japanese attacks and his parlous supply situation, Potts has been forced to commit companies piecemeal. As companies arrived at Isurava, they were committed to the position that was in the most parlous state of defence. The 53rd Battalion is in defence at Alola. There's one platoon from Alpha Company protecting the rear. Bravo Company is on the right flank, east of the Alola-Isurava road. Charlie Company is forward of Alola, and a company from the 16th Battalion has the left flank above Alola. At this stage, Battalion Headquarters has no reports from Don Company. They are, however, under command of Captain Sublett, one of the company commanders from the 2nd 16th Battalion. They're out on the eastern flank, east of the waterfall, in support of Sublett's attack to clear the ridgeline above Abuwari. The 2nd 14th, which originally had been at Isurava, had been able to effect a clean break from the attacking Japanese, and they had withdrawn south to Isurava Rest House. This had been done in good order, and almost all of their equipment had come with them. On the eastern flank, above Abuwari, was to have seen Don Company in position for their attack by 0800. 0800 came and went. Captain King, the OC of Don Company, had been given orders the night before to move up onto the ridgeline and be in position to outflank the Japanese position. This attack was going to be quite important because it was going to signal the start of Sublet's company assault. The Japanese would find themselves under attack from the west and the south, forcing them to withdraw. By 0900, there was still no word from Don Company. Their attack hadn't commenced. However, medium machine gun fire was directed into battalion headquarters from the vicinity of the Abawari area. 8 casualties were caused, including Captain Hogan, who was the regimental medical officer of the 53rd Battalion, and Lieutenant Brooks, the attached signals officer from the 49th Battalion. Battalion headquarters can hear fighting to the north at Isurava Rest House and to the west. So battalion headquarters, along with brigade headquarters, now has contact on the west, north and east. At 1200, Lieutenant Lawler, a platoon commander from Don Company, reports back into battalion headquarters. He states that Don Company cannot make it around to the top of the ridgeline as ordered by Captain Sublet and that they were coming back. He is ordered to report back to Don Company immediately and to give verbal instructions to Captain King to carry on as ordered by Captain Sublet. Sublet had already decided that he couldn't wait any longer and he was going to put the attack in himself. Rather than putting the attack in with the full effect of Don Company attacking from the south, Sublet decided to weaken his main assault by taking 2 platoons and attempting to get them around the left flank of the Japanese. However, the Japanese, as per their SOPs, are trying to outflank Sublet themselves. At 11:30, he reports to brigade headquarters that the Japanese have infiltrated behind Bravo Company and they're now in between the creek crossing and the waterfall. The brigade war diary records from 12:10 to 13:10 heavy firing above Abawari, and at 13:10, Captain Sublet reports that he is not having much success and it was impossible to see the Japanese positions. At 13:55, brigade headquarters receives a very disturbing message from Captain Sublet, and that is that he can see firing on the high ground between Rest House and brigade headquarters. That means the Japanese have broken through with their attacks from the north. Remember, at this point, the brigade has no reserve. At 1500, the brigade commander gets confirmation that the enemy is between the 2nd 14th to the north. Brigadier Potts makes the decision to withdraw the brigade back to Eora Creek. The brigade war diary reports that the withdrawal began at 1600 hours, and it writes the brigade headquarters advance party followed by the 53rd Battalion, and there's a note, see account of ops. It then goes on to state that the brigade headquarters was established halfway from Alola to Eora Creek. Interestingly enough, the one page that talks about the 30th of August in the Brigade War Diary general narrative of events, that page is missing. So I guess it's going to be really hard to piece together what the brigade commander was thinking happened during that time. At 16:30, those orders from brigade headquarters were received at 53rd Battalion headquarters. They were ordered to stand by in battle order, ready to withdraw. Orders were given to Alpha Company to hold the river crossing until 1900. Don Company was to withdraw along Eora Creek at 1800 to Eora Creek Camp, and Bravo Company was to be ready to move at short notice. Major Spring reported back to battalion headquarters at 2030 and reports that his company was dispersed during an attack while he was absent at 2nd 14th Battalion headquarters awaiting orders, and his company could not be located. He returned to his unit under the orders of the CO of the 2nd 14th. The battalion war diary goes on to state that one platoon of Alpha Company under Captain Ahern was ordered to withdraw and move back to Eora Creek Camp at 22:30. Battalion headquarters personnel followed then Bravo Company with Major Hawkins following. Movement was very slow on Eora Creek Track as many stretcher cases were being carried by natives. Darkness until midnight made movement very hard, with troops constantly falling and slipping. The precipitous withdrawal had been brought about by increasing pressure being brought to bear by the Japanese on the 2nd 14th, who were in a defensive position at Isurava Rest House. The 2nd 16th War Diary describes the situation. During the morning and afternoon, intermittent mortar fire by the enemy had caused some casualties amongst our forward troops. A raiding patrol of one section had been sent forward from Alpha Company to endeavour to carry out an ambush against the enemy. This new area, held as a defensive position, was unsuitable in every way. The main task of our troops was to hold the track, which provided our lines of communication, and with the small number of troops available, it was impossible to also hold the high ground, which was so vulnerable on our left flank. The enemy quickly took advantage of this approach, and from approximately 1100 hours onwards commenced infiltration tactics towards our left and rear. As the afternoon wore on, the position became more serious, and at 1600, orders were received to hold the present position until 1700 and then withdraw through Alola, where 2 companies of the 2nd 16th Battalion would be in position as an extricating force. By this time, the track in our rear between our position and Alola had been cut by enemy fire, and a slight detour track had been made. The CO issued orders for evacuation of the RAP, wounded, and a portion of battalion headquarters under Captain Roden to move back to position at Alola. Well, just prior to this, Colonel Honor and the 39th Battalion, less one depleted company, moved back acting on instructions from Brigade. The enemy were exerting pressure on our left rear, and at this stage they forced the company of the 39th Battalion back towards the track and then occupied their dugouts where a supply of our grenades, a Bren gun and ammunition had been left. The CO, on receiving this information, sent the Pioneer Platoon under Lieutenant Greenwood and number 8 Platoon from Alpha Company, number 12 Platoon from Bravo Company to reinforce the rear positions. Orders were then issued for the withdrawal. The enemy were in position above our rearmost troops and also further back towards Alola on a prominent salient which ran eastwards down the track. Charlie and Don companies, plus a platoon of the 2nd 16th Battalion, were to attack along the high ground above us on a line running parallel to the track, dealing with the enemy above our rear troops, and push on to the main salient to clear the enemy from there and then continue on to Alola. The attack was to commence at 1700 hours. On the attack commencing, our rear troops, consisting of remnants of 1 company of the 39th Battalion, 1 platoon of Alpha Company, 1 platoon of Bravo Company, and a portion of Headquarters Company, were to move back along the track to Alola. Battalion Headquarters were then to follow along with Alpha and Bravo Companies, plus a company of the 53rd Battalion, acting as a rear guard. At 1700 hours, Battalion Headquarters were dispersed along the track with Alpha and Bravo companies, each less 1 platoon, approximately 50 yards to the rear or north, and a company of the 53rd Battalion further back again, all ready to move back along the track towards Alola. At 1705, a terrific burst of fire swept the track where Battalion Headquarters were in position. This fire appeared to come from 2 directions, from the southwest and the west. Alpha and Bravo companies further to the rear had opened up earlier. Heavy firing and much yelling continued for some minutes. Casualties occurred amongst Battalion Headquarters, Alpha, Bravo and Charlie companies, and a platoon of the 2nd 16th Battalion. Battalion Headquarters and troops along the track dispersed and were split up into small groups who endeavoured to make their way back to Alola on the east of the track. The CO, adjutant and several ORs were in one party, the intelligence officer, RSM and a number of ORs in another. Many of the troops managed to get back to Alola during the night, and while Charlie and Don companies, who were caused some casualties amongst the enemy, moved back along the track. The rear company of the 53rd Battalion went bush, while Alpha and Bravo companies organised stretcher parties and got most of the wounded back. So I'll pause reading the war diary of the 2nd 16th Battalion to start the defence for the 53rd Battalion. It is quite difficult to piece together what exactly happened on the 30th of August. It is a day when command and control is failing amongst the brigade. Companies and platoons are all mixed up. There are a large number of casualties, including a large number of missing in action. But this is a really good example where we might be seeing a little bit of scapegoating coming into play here. Firstly, Charlie Company is given the role of the rear guard for a battalion that is conducting a withdrawal whilst in contact. This is one of the most difficult tactical tasks that can be given to a company. Their ultimate goal will be to achieve a clean break from the Japanese, who will, of course, be trying to maintain contact with the battalion as they withdraw. Withdrawals run the risk of turning into a rout and seeing large numbers of casualties. And yet, Charlie Company 53rd Battalion was given that most important job of being the rear guard. This job is made all the more difficult because there's no artillery. Traditionally, artillery would be used to suppress the enemy to ensure that the clean break was achieved. Of course, on the Kokoda Track, there was no Australian artillery at this point. That lack of artillery makes the role of the rearguard that much more difficult, and yet it's been given to Charlie Company 53rd Battalion. Now the second point, did they go bush? Well, yes, but by 0400 hours on the next day when the 2nd 16th was able to sort itself out, it reported 172 missing in action. This included the CO, adjutant, intelligence officer, and a series of other officers and the RSM. The casualties that they'd taken during the time that they'd been in contact with the Japanese at Isurava were so severe that Captain Roden was given the temporary role of commanding officer. Captain Dickinson was to become his 2IC, and Lance Corporal Watson was the acting intelligence officer. Lieutenants Greenwood and McGavin were the new temporary OCs of Headquarters Company and Charlie Company. We're not really sure what happened to the CO of the 2nd 16th, but a chaplain at Boona would later see an Australian officer with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel who'd been captured by the Japanese and marched to Boona. This officer was later executed, and it is possible that that was Lieutenant Colonel Key. The men of Charlie Company 53rd Battalion would do what the other companies were doing now. They split up into small groups, work their way through the Japanese lines, and return to friendly positions as soon as they could. This was incredibly difficult given the terrain. It was incredibly dangerous given the tactical situation. The Australian troops are withdrawing at the moment. The longer they take, the further they're going to have to move behind enemy lines. Charlie Company wasn't the only 53rd Battalion company to be given an important role in the withdrawal from Isurava. Here is an excerpt of an interview with Sergeant Keith Irwin of Alpha Company. He's describing the role that they are given on that night.
The battalions in front of us, the 39th Battalion and the 2nd 14th Battalion by this time were in front of us, and they were in retreat. And I was with A Company, and we'd taken up this defensive position right on the track itself. And as the 39th came through first, then the 2nd 14th come through our lines, and this officer, I don't even know his name, from the 2nd 14th, he said, "The Japanese are advancing this way." He said, "We're going back to take up defensive positions." And he said that you hold the line here, and he said, "We'll let you know when it's time to come back and join us back in the rear positions." He never let us know for some reason or other. We never got the word. The next thing we know, we can see Japanese in force coming down towards us, and they were dividing up into two, and they're going. We're on a sort of a ridge, and they're going down both sides of the ridge, and obviously their task was to encircle us and cut us off. So we did a fighting retreat out of there, and we didn't lose a man. We were able to get all of us got out of it. We kept the Japs at bay, and we eventually got back to this to where the other units were, and all the units then took up this. We had this fighting retreat all the way back to Moresby.
The 1st of September sees the battalion moving through Eora Creek village. The battalion war diary states that no further reports of Charlie Company have been received. On that day, the battalion is ordered back to Myola. Bravo Company is kept well under control by Captain Bryce. However, the war diary states that the companies appeared to lose control and far too much straggling and independent movement of troops occurred in the other companies. On the 2nd of September, Major Hawkins, who's the temporary CO of the 53rd Battalion, receives orders at Myola that the 53rd Battalion is to be relieved of all automatic weapons, rifles and equipment, and the battalion, less one company, is to move back to Port Moresby. As such, 104 troops under Captain Bryce remain in Myola, and they're going to be used for carrying and guard duties. The balance of the troops under Major Spring move back to Afogi, and it's at Afogi at 1700 that they meet Lieutenant Colonel Cameron. This is Lieutenant Colonel Alan Cameron. He has just been promoted and he assumes command of the battalion. At Afogi on the 3rd of September, another 40 men are detached to collect stores from planes that had been dropped at Afogi. The adjutant inspected all of the men with the intent of just selecting those that were fit. The war diary states, troops are in a bad condition. Feet, due to being in wet boots, are rubbing and in poor condition. Socks had to be cut off before they could be removed. This has shown the necessity for much more supervision by platoon commanders and the necessity for changing socks. Incorrect lacing of boots caused blisters and ankle rub. Interesting that this is in the war diary. They've been on the track now for 3.5 weeks. I wonder what everyone else's feet are like at that point. One piece of good news for the battalion is that 50 troops from Charlie Company march back into battalion positions. These are the troops that had been assigned to the 2nd 14th Battalion and were part of that withdrawal. Work commences to destroy supplies at Myola because it is now apparent that Myola is not going to be able to be held. This is a critical blow to Brigadier Potts because Myola is where supplies have been airdropped in, and this is only going to make his supply position more tenuous. The brigade prepares to withdraw to Afogi, and it's interesting, the war diary states, the condition of the troops can be judged to some extent in that the 2nd 16th Battalion during the day lost 1 officer and 32 ORs through dysentery. The rest were saturated and exhausted. On the 5th of September, the move to Afogi is completed, but the troops are exhausted. Elements of the 53rd Battalion remain covering the Kokoda Track junction. Conditions were made considerably worse by torrential rain, which commenced at 1400 hours and continued unabated throughout the rest of the day and night. It was stated definitely by MOs that, particularly in the case of the 2nd 16th Battalion, unless some treatment was given immediately to feet, considerable difficulty would be experienced in further movement of troops. 2nd 16th Battalion, they are very cognizant of the requirement to maintain the feet of all of the soldiers, and the fact that their feet are breaking down, that really does highlight the poor conditions on the Kokoda Track. The next morning, the 6th of September at 0700 hours, it was reported that the patrol of the 53rd Battalion on the Kokoda Track junction, after a quiet night, were pulling out. It was too late to get a message to them that they were to stay. A patrol from the 2nd 27th was ordered out immediately to the same position, their progress being hampered by the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions moving out of Afogi. This patrol was led by Lieutenant Frederick Bell, and it had barely reached the junction when 300 Japanese were seen approaching from Myola. The patrol attempted to move into position for an ambush. However, the Japanese scouts opened fire. In the ensuing fighting, 4 Australians were wounded and 4 were killed before the patrol was able to withdraw. This standing patrol from the 53rd Battalion was under the command of Captain Bryce. They'd originally been ordered to remain in place until 2200 on the 5th of September. At 2000 hours, he had reported enemy movement observed from Kargi, with lanterns being used. And at 2030, the CO, Lieutenant Colonel Cameron, had issued orders for Captain Bryce's company to withdraw at 0800 on the 6th of September. So it looks like there's some sort of command and control issue between the CO, the new CO of the 53rd Battalion, and Brigade Headquarters. For the majority of the troops in the 53rd Battalion, most of them will be headed back to Port Moresby now. On the 12th of September, 100 of the soldiers will be rearmed and transferred to the 39th Battalion. On the 26th of October, most of the remainder would be reintegrated back with the 55th to form the 55th 53rd Battalion. This is almost a year after the formation of the 53rd Battalion. What I've tried to do with this podcast series up to date is highlight everything that the battalion has done from the 10th of August, when Lieutenant Colonel Ward receives his initial orders to move up the Kokoda Trail, through to the end of August, where they are ordered back to Port Moresby, having been judged by Brigadier Potts as combat ineffective. The 53rd Battalion was raised as many battalions are raised in a time of national crisis. They were raised just 6 weeks prior to the Japanese attacking Malaya and Pearl Harbor. When we look at the 53rd Battalion, and they weren't the worst battalion in the Army, when we look at their tactical performance, we're given an idea about how a battalion will perform if they are raised and trained in this manner. When we look at their performance, we see poor patrolling, poor march discipline, poor endurance on the track, poor weapon handling, lack of aggression, poor procedures within battalion headquarters, poor communication with brigade headquarters. The performance, however, of the individual companies varies significantly. We see that particularly in the fighting at Isurava as the companies are spread out. The battalion is not actually employed as a whole battalion. Given the nature of fighting that Brigadier Porter and then Brigadier Potts find themselves in, they are required to employ the companies within the battalion piecemeal to meet the next pressing disaster that they're trying to avert. I've got one assessment of the battalion's performance, and that's by Nick Anderson in his book To Kokoda. He writes, "A fair assessment of the Australian performance throughout the campaign recognises both the good and the bad. The Australian units initially tasked with confronting the Japanese were militia units. The 39th Battalion performed magnificently and beyond expectation. The 53rd Battalion performed poorly, and its adverse reputation from this particular campaign is deserved. However, it was under-equipped, inadequately trained, and poorly commanded. The death of the 53rd CO early in its first battle compounded the battalion's problems, and many of the men in its ranks later served with distinction at Sanananda and Bougainville." This raises two really interesting points about the performance of the 53rd Battalion. Some of these troops are not far away from fighting in the Battle of the Beaches, and they're going to perform really well. So it's not the soldiers themselves. He also compares the 53rd with the 39th Battalion, and I think there's a lot of value in looking for what the similarities and the differences are between both battalions in how they were raised, how they were trained, and how they were sustained. This is the big question. What were the factors that inhibited the 53rd Battalion from fighting as well as it could have at Isurava? I've got one other assessment of the battle at Isurava and the 53rd Battalion. This is by Lieutenant Colonel Frank Sublett, DSO MC. Now, he is writing with a cold, clinical approach, very much so with 2020 hindsight. However, I think it's really important because this is Frank Sublett. He was the captain that was responsible for the attack at Abu Ari on the eastern flank. He was the one waiting for Don Company to put their attack in on the morning of the 30th of August. His view is important because he is a CO. He goes on to be the CO of the 2nd 16th Battalion, so he understands the requirements of fighting in the jungle, but he was there with the 53rd Battalion fighting with Don Company. I think his view of the 53rd Battalion is very valid. His assessment of the Battle of Isurava is such. To have any chance of securing the vital Kokoda airstrip, Potts would have had to concentrate his two AIF battalions in position before the arrival of the main body of the Japanese 144th Regiment on the 24th of August. He would have stood a good chance of holding the airstrip against Shukamoto's 1st Battalion until more troops with heavy weapons could be flown in. However, this was a remote possibility, since they would have had to have been flown from Queensland, where only the 25th Brigade was available. Even had there been no supply deficiency at Myola, the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th could not have been concentrated forward until the 26th of August, and would have had to contend with the complete 144th Regiment, which would have been supported by the 41st Regiment, less 1 battalion, which landed near Gona on the 21st of August. As it was, in terms of his two AIF battalions, Potts was opposed by 3 and then 5 infantry battalions, which in addition had artillery and engineer support, besides medium and heavy machine guns and mortars. He was at all stages outnumbered and outgunned. Because the Australians found the environment strange and threatening, patrolling had been ineffective and provided no useful information on enemy strength or intentions for the commander. The standing patrol or outpost forward of the Daniki track was overmanned for the information that it could give the commander at Isurava, and contributed to neglect of off-track approaches used by the enemy to reconnoitre the defenders' positions. In other words, the Japanese were able to use minor attacks on the outpost as a diversion, which had the added benefit to the enemy of drawing more troops from Isurava to strengthen the outpost. Probably because of Shukamoto's experience in the conflict with the 39th Battalion, General Horry displayed surprising caution in his build-up to battle by devoting 3 days to fighting patrols, which effectively defined and delineated the Australian defensive positions, all with the possibility that the few defenders would allow him passage with his main body, which he would need to conserve for the fighting to be expected around Port Moresby. Having been issued 16 days rations when they landed on the 18th of August, the main body still had 10 days rations on the 24th, but this would have been reduced to 4 days supply by the 30th of August when they broke through Maroubra Force defences. Given the Japanese superiority in numbers and armament, and their manoeuvrability contrasted with the immobility of the defenders and the position's lack of depth, it was inevitable that Isurava would be overrun. The night move back to the Rest House Ridge seemed a desperate measure, and since it was obvious that an Australian offensive was out of the question, Potts might have done better by withdrawing the whole force by a longer bound in order to avoid a running fight and to save a higher proportion of his troops to sap the strength of the enemy as he pursued. Unless rapid and massive reinforcement was available to Brigadier Potts, Isurava, Alola and Abawari held no intrinsic value to him. Substantial Allied air attacks from north of Isurava to Kokoda would have altered the picture, but they were not tried and may not have been an option anyway. If Brigadier Potts had been better informed of the enemy's strength, he might have judged that Isurava had no value as real estate and withdrawn his force earlier, unless his superiors had ordered that he should allow his force to be destroyed rather than concede ground. Although this was a setback for the Australians, they had shown that the Japanese were not super soldiers when they ran before the Australians' bayonet charge on the left flank, when they had made no attempt to counterattack at Abawari, and when they repeatedly fell back after penetrating the Australian positions at Isurava. The 53rd Battalion displayed inadequacies in training and preparation for combat, but patrol operations commanded by officers such as MacDonald and Ahern tended to show the troops in a better light. While diaries of soldiers in the Hori battalions on the Abawari flank register a certain respect for the 53rd Battalion soldiers who tried to clear Abawari before the advent of the 2nd 16th Battalion. But when Potts peremptorily sent the battalion out of the battle, its morale and commitment fell. Unless they could be replaced immediately by the 2nd 27th, and they could not, they might have been of more use at the front. I think this is a great assessment of the battalion. They're not as bad as their reputation suggests. In fact, they're not bad at all. They're an untrained, untried battalion trying to work out for the first time what combat is all about. They're doing that in some of the worst terrain in the world, and they're doing that against a battle-hardened enemy that is very comfortable operating in the jungle. Only in the most direst of circumstances would it be appropriate to employ a battalion like this in the way that they were. The next few episodes are going to look at the fundamental mistakes that were made in the raise, train and sustain function as the 53rd Battalion was prepared for deployment. We're then going to look at the actual employment of the 53rd Battalion and the other battalions that they fought with on the trail, and we're going to look for operational level mistakes. These are the mistakes that were committed at New Guinea Force Headquarters. Lastly, we're going to look at the big mistakes, the strategic level mistakes. There's been a lot written about the mistakes that were committed at the strategic and grand strategic level of war for the New Guinea campaign. As Sun Tzu said, strategy without tactics is the long road to victory, but tactics without strategy is the din before defeat. To save us from becoming too philosophical about the levels of war, I think it's really appropriate that we leave the last words in this podcast to Sergeant Keith Irwin. Here are his thoughts on the battalion being taken out of the fight just after Isurava.
A new brigadier came up, a fellow named Brigadier Potts, and I think he was a Middle East fellow, and he was never commanded a battalion, but he was a brigadier. And he'd been there one day, and he pulled the 53rd out of the line, and he nearly broke all of our hearts. And we don't know for sure why, but we felt that one of the reasons might have been the fact that our colonel was killed because the company commander never was in the right place where he should have been. And so he pulled the 53rd out with the excuse that they were insufficiently trained to be going into action. And the incredible thing about this was that prior to Brigadier Potts getting there, the brigadier in charge of the 30th Brigade, which was our battalion, the 53rd and the 39th, one of our companies did this the company, A company, which held the front. When we got back to Port Moresby, he lined all the whole company up and congratulated them on this magnificent job they did up at Dennehy. And yet this other brigadier, after one day, pulled them out of the line. So it was a real topsy-turvy situation. We reached a stage where we didn't know where we were, what we were going to do, and what was going to happen to us.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.